The Slovak Republic push for peace in Ukraine. Is Southeast Europe turning against the war? Author's notes. This article concerns the ongoing war in Ukraine and the hard realities of Ukraine continuing the war in the most unemotional way possible. The war was inflicted on the Ukrainian people not by their choice and is unfortunate, tragic, and unjust, so conclusions and statements are made not ignoring what happened and is happening to the people of Ukraine. On Thursday, November 23, 2023, the new Prime Minister of the Slovak Republic gave a dire warning to the continuing of the war in Ukraine. Robert Fico, who is the new left-wing populist leader of Slovakia, stated that the war in Ukraine would last until 2030 and leave 500 to 600,000 additional deaths if it continues its current course. Fico gave no proof to back up his claim, but is more of a shock statement to draw attention to his position. The Slovak Republic position is another catalyst to begin peace talks, not through offering new solutions, but more through traditional pro-Russian sentiments in Slovakia and other southeastern European countries to put pressure on the European Union, EU, to press harder to end the war. Prime Minister Fico's position, one of which he ran on, is that the Slovak Republic would no longer provide arms to Ukraine in its war against Russia. He added that he would not support any more EU sanctions against Russia. Fico stated as well that he wanted the Slovak Republic to stop immigration into its country, which includes Ukrainians displaced by the war. During a meeting of EU leaders in October, he stated that the EU should be peacemakers and not arms suppliers, and that it would be better to have 10 years of peace talks than 10 years of continuing the war. It was on Thursday in a meeting with Czech Republic, he reinforced his assertion that peace talks should start versus allowing the killing to continue. This is another southeastern European country, the other is Hungary, that have come out against continuing the war in Ukraine or sanctioning Russia. The difference is that Fico stated that if other European countries wanted to provide aid or military assistance, he would not stand in the way of that happening. Hungary's leader, Viktor Orban, has taken a harder stance and is acknowledging he will stop any EU sanctions against Russia or any other government or weapons assistance from the EU to Ukraine. Unanimous consent is required by all EU member countries for more aid for Ukraine or sanctions against Russia, so Orban is willing to go further than Fico in opposing Ukraine-Russian policy. Southeast Europe's support for the war is tenuous. The Slovak Republic and Hungary are the most vocal to end the war, but Greece is traditionally non-interventionist and has a strong pro-Russian element and is giving soft support for continuing the war in Ukraine. Greece is also needing EU financial support, so it would not push too hard against the majority EU sentiment unless that sentiment starts to change. Turkey, though not in the EU, is in NATO and has been known to be pro-Russian in its sentiment. Bulgaria, though traditionally having close ties to Russia, has continued to be a strong supporter of the continuing the EU policy in Ukraine and seems to be firmly aligned with current EU policy. It can be said that Southeastern Europe's sentiment is tenuous to continuing the war, and if the larger NATO support declines, it could push this part of Europe firmly to call to ending the war. The RAND Corporation, in its assessment, stated its belief that the support for war by NATO countries, most of whom are in the EU, would soften if there is a lack of Ukraine military success. The Ukrainian forces had spectacular success in its 2022 spring offensive, and the level of aid and type of arms given to the Ukraine were increased in expectation of a repeat in Ukraine's 2023 spring offensive. The Ukraine spring offensive, despite greater Western aid, was largely a failure with negligible gains. Some leaders in Ukraine and more Western leaders have assessed that the war has stalemated, which is a demographic challenge for Ukraine. This opened the door to push for Ukraine to open peace talks in October. It is too early to determine if the RAND Corporation's assessment is correct, but the more vocal position of Hungary and Slovakia, the obstructionist nature of Turkey, and now the divisions in the U.S. over aid to Ukraine, seems to indicate that there are cracks forming to continue the war in both NATO and the EU. As of now, calls for peace have been outright rejected by Ukraine and, surprisingly, Germany, until Russia abandons all Ukrainian-held territory. The Biden administration has not called for peace and continues to push the U.S. Congress for aid, but the political reality going into the election year will mean less material support for the war, despite what Biden wants. Despite these rejections of peace talks, NATO leadership, former leaders of NATO, and think tanks have offered what the future could be in Europe and Ukraine. The proposal lacks many specifics, but do provide openings and frameworks of peace talks or the cost of continuing down the current path. On the other hand, Orban has been the most vocal of making his case that Ukraine cannot win the war and continuing the war is pointless in its current course. He is not supporting expanding the war, so it appears to be advocating that Ukraine has lost and needs to accept that fact. Orban is willing to argue that his point to the EU, so they accept these facts during the December EU summit. The new Slovak position alone will not change the EU's current position, and PICO offers no suggestions of a peace solution. What PICO offers is giving Orban more clout in that he is not the only one in the EU calling for the end of the war. Orban's argument includes that the EU needs to accept the facts that the U.S. with its political position cannot be expected to provide more support than in the past. NATO and the EU will have to accept the new realities of softening support while trying to keep Ukraine from collapsing on the battlefield and losing all bargaining power with the Russians in any potential peace talks. Whatever is decided, support for Ukraine in 2024 will be much different than was offered in 2022 and 2023, and that is not a good position for Ukraine to continue the war. Maybe those powers to be should have started peace talks in the summer of 2022 after the Ukrainian spring success.